The first thing Hale saw when he stepped back into his hometown after 12 years away was not the old church, the familiar bakery, or the little house where he had grown up. It was his father sitting on a cold pavement in broad daylight, his clothes worn thin, his gray hair uncombed, holding out a chipped wooden bowl and quietly begging strangers for enough rice to eat. Everett stopped in the middle of the street as if someone had struck him. The man who had once carried him on his shoulders worked 2 jobs to pay his school fees and stood proudly at every one of his childhood games was now being ignored by people who walked past him without even looking down. If you believe that kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances can change a life, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share this story with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so our family can continue bringing you stories that remind us what truly matters. Everett had not planned to return home that morning. He had been living in another city for more than a decade, building a successful career in corporate finance, wearing expensive suits, eating in restaurants where a single meal cost more than his father once earned in a week. He had become the kind of man who measured life by deadlines, investments, promotions, and the number of people who knew his name. Yet beneath all of it was a wound he refused to touch. His relationship with his father, Walter Hale, had broken 12 years earlier, after a bitter argument that neither man had known how to repair. Everett had wanted to attend a prestigious university in another state, but Walter had told him they could not afford it. Everett had interpreted those words as a lack of faith in him. He had shouted that his father had never believed he could become anything. Walter, exhausted after years of working long hours, had responded with words he immediately regretted, telling his son that if he was so ashamed of the life his father had provided, he should go build a better one without him. Everett had packed a suitcase before sunrise the next morning and left. At first, he expected Walter to call. He waited for an apology. Then he waited for another. Days became weeks, weeks became months, and eventually the silence became part of his life. Everett convinced himself that his father was stubborn and proud, while Walter convinced himself that his son had finally found the life he wanted and no longer needed an old man standing in his way. Years passed without either of them making the first move. Everett sent money anonymously a few times during the early years, but he never wrote his name on the envelopes. Walter, too proud to ask for help, returned one of the envelopes unopened. The distance between them hardened into something that looked permanent. Then one summer morning, Everett received a short letter from an elderly neighbor named Beatrice, who had known the Hale family for decades. The letter contained only a few sentences, but they frightened him. It said that Walter's health had declined, that he had lost his home after falling behind on property taxes, and that he had refused to accept help from anyone. Beatrice had not written to shame Everett. She had written because she believed some doors needed to be opened before they disappeared forever. Everett read the letter 3 times before booking the first available flight. Now, standing on the familiar street, Everett could hardly breathe. Walter was only a few yards away, sitting against the wall of a closed storefront with a small wooden bowl resting in his trembling hands. His coat was faded, his shoes were cracked, and his fingers shook whenever someone passed. A woman carrying grocery bags glanced at him, then quickly looked away. A businessman stepped around him. A teenager laughed with his friends as he walked past. Walter did not complain. He simply lowered his eyes and continued, asking politely if anyone could spare a little rice. Everett felt something inside him collapse. He wanted to run to his father, but shame held him back. He suddenly remembered the last image he had of Walter before leaving town, standing in the doorway of their old house with tears in his eyes but refusing to let them fall. For 12 years, Everett had imagined that moment differently. He had remembered himself as the wounded son and Walter as the cruel father. But seeing the old man now, Everett realized there had been 2 wounded people standing in that doorway, and both had been too proud and too frightened to admit it. He walked toward him slowly. Walter looked up. For a moment, neither recognized the other. Everett had changed from a thin, young man into a broad-shouldered adult with silver beginning at his temples. Walter stared at him with tired blue eyes. Then his face changed. The bowl slipped from his hands and rolled across the pavement. Everett whispered his father's name, and Walter looked away as though he had seen a ghost. The silence between them was heavier than any argument they had ever had. Everett knelt and picked up the bowl. He noticed that there were only a few grains of rice left inside. His father reached for it, embarrassed. But Everett held it gently against his chest. He could not understand how the man who had once skipped meals so Everett could have enough food was now begging strangers for a handful of rice. What happened next shocked everyone watching from the street. Everett took off his expensive jacket, placed it around his father's shoulders, and then sat down on the pavement beside him. He did not take him away immediately. He did not tell him to stand up. He did not ask why he had allowed his life to become this way. He simply sat beside him, shoulder touching shoulder, exactly as Walter had once sat beside him on the front steps after Everett lost his first school baseball game. Then Everett reached into his pocket, took out his wallet, and pulled out every bill he had. But instead of handing the money to his father, he stood, walked into the nearby grocery store, and returned carrying several bags of rice, fresh bread, fruit, milk, canned vegetables, and other food. People who had watched Walter begging moments earlier now stood, silently as Everett opened one of the bags and placed food into his father's hands. Walter began to cry. Everett did too. Neither tried to hide it. But Everett soon discovered that his father's situation was worse than he had imagined. Walter had not simply lost his home. He had spent years secretly paying the medical bills of an old friend who had no family, using the savings he had managed to build after Everett left. When that friend died, Walter was nearly broke. Then a workplace injury made it difficult for him to continue working. He sold his belongings one by one, then his car, then his home. He refused to tell Everett because he believed his son had built a successful life and should not be dragged back into the past. The most painful truth came when Beatrice showed Everett a small wooden box Walter had kept beneath the few clothes he still owned. Inside were photographs, school certificates, a broken wristwatch Everett had given him as a child, and every birthday card Everett had ever made. There was also a stack of letters Walter had written over the years, but never sent. Everett read them with shaking hands. In one letter, Walter wrote that he was proud of his son even, though he did not know whether his son still considered him a father. In another, he admitted that telling Everett to leave had been the greatest mistake of his life. In the final letter, written only months earlier, Walter had said that if Everett ever came home, he hoped his son would not remember him as an angry man, but as the father who had once carried him through the rain because he was too tired to walk. Everett broke down. He realized that while he had spent 12 years waiting for his father to apologize, Walter had spent those same 12 years carrying regret like a stone inside his chest. But forgiveness did not happen in a single beautiful moment. Everett took his father to a small daytime clinic and arranged for him to receive proper medical care. He rented a modest apartment for Walter and began repairing it himself rather than simply paying someone else to do it. At first, Walter resisted every bit of help. He told Everett that he did not need charity. Everett finally understood that his father was not refusing love. He was protecting the last piece of dignity he believed he had left. So Everett changed the way he helped. Instead of making Walter feel like a helpless old man, he asked him to teach him things. Walter had been a gifted carpenter in his younger years, and Everett asked him to help restore an old wooden table. They spent afternoons sanding the surface, replacing broken legs, and laughing awkwardly whenever one of them made a mistake. Slowly, the table became more than furniture. It became a bridge between two men who had lost 12 years to pride. One afternoon, Everett found Walter sitting at that table, staring at an old photograph of the two of them. Walter admitted that he had been angry for years because he believed Everett had abandoned him. Everett admitted that he had been angry because he believed Walter had never believed in him. They finally understood that both had been wrong. Walter had believed in Everett so deeply that he was terrified of watching his son fail far from home. Everett had loved his father so deeply that he had mistaken fear for rejection. Then came the moment that changed everything. Everett told Walter that he wanted him to come live with him in the city. Walter immediately refused. He said he did not want to become a burden. Everett did not argue. Instead, he told his father that he was not asking him to become dependent on his son. He was asking him to become part of his life again. Walter stared at him for a long time before quietly placing his hand on Everett's. Months later, the people in their hometown began noticing something remarkable. The successful businessman who had once hurried through town without looking had anyone now spent his mornings helping his father prepare meals for elderly neighbors. Walter, who had once begged for rice on that same pavement, began teaching free woodworking lessons to young people who could not afford classes. Everett used some of his savings to help restore an abandoned community center, but he insisted that Walter design the furniture inside it. The first day the center opened, dozens of people gathered under the warm afternoon sun. Children ran through the doors. Older residents sat at wooden tables made by Walter. Everett stood near his father, watching him smile as people thanked him. Walter looked healthier, but more importantly, he looked needed again. A young boy approached Walter and asked him who had taught him to build such beautiful things. Walter smiled and pointed toward Everett. The boy looked confused because Everett clearly was not a carpenter. Walter simply said that his son had taught him something more important than woodworking, that sometimes a person does not need to be rescued as much as they need to know they have not been forgotten. Everett heard those words and lowered his head, unable to stop the tears. Years later, the wooden bowl that Walter had used to beg for rice sat on a shelf inside the community center. It was no longer a symbol of poverty. Everett had placed a small plaque beneath it, not to remind people of humiliation, but to remind them of compassion. The plaque carried a simple message: never be too proud to help, and never be too ashamed to accept love. Walter lived long enough to see his son become the man he had always hoped he would be. Everett never forgot the lesson of that morning. Wealth had given him comfort. Success had given him influence, but neither had given him peace. Peace came when he stopped asking who was right and started asking who needed love. And Walter learned something too. Forgiveness was not pretending the past had never happened. It was choosing not to let the past control the future. One bright afternoon, years after Everett had found his father begging for rice, the two men sat together outside the community center. Children were playing nearby, neighbors were carrying groceries home, and the streets were filled with ordinary life. Walter looked at his son and smiled. Everett reached over and held his father's hand. Neither man needed to say anything. They had already said enough through the years they had lost, the tears they had cried, the meals they had shared, and the second chance they had finally chosen. Sometimes life does not give us the chance to undo our mistakes. Sometimes it gives us something even more precious, the chance to stop making them. A father and son can lose 12 years to pride, but one act of kindness can open a door that both believed had been locked forever. Everett thought he was returning home to save his father, but in the end he discovered that his father had been waiting all those years to save him from becoming a man who had everything except the people he loved. Before we end, I want to ask you something from the heart. If you were Everett, would you have forgiven your father after 12 years of silence? Or would the pain have been too deep? Leave a meaningful comment and share what this story taught you about forgiveness, family, and second chances. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Because sometimes the person sitting on the pavement with an empty bowl is not asking only for food. Sometimes they are waiting for someone to remind them that they are still loved. And sometimes the greatest gift we can give another human being is not money, not success, and not even an apology. Sometimes it is simply this: coming home before it is too late.